I appreciate the opportunity to show you what we do in my lab and the center that I direct. It is called the Alliance for Cardiovascular Diagnostic and Treatment Innovation, and my center combines both engineers, applied mathematicians, and clinicians. So today I'm going to talk to you. It's a tale of two technologies. The first technology is the digital twin. Digital twin is not a new technology. It is basically creating a computational model of an entity. It has been used a lot in industry for many years to optimize processes and operation of facilities. In healthcare, it is believed that it will be a disruptive technology because it will allow building of computational models of separate organs or the patient even based on tracked data. And one of the biggest advantages of creating these computational models that represent all the different components in the organ and their interaction is that what it will allow is to predict what would be the response of the patient to the treatment. So this is a very important benefit. So this is one technology that I will talk to you today. So we basically build models of the patient's heart. So it is a virtual model of the patient, and we can of the patient heart, and we can basically play scenarios for treatment. The second technology, of course, is artificial intelligence. So what I will talk to you today is approaches that use only the digital twin technologies, use only AI, or most importantly, they synergistically combine the digital twin with artificial intelligence. So you can improve model building, you can also do deduction of mechanisms from what an artificial intelligence algorithm will predict. So here are the goals of our work. What we do is we develop digital twin hearts and AI technologies entirely for clinical application. And here the emphasis is on the fact that it's really tailored to the application. We really always try to validate the usefulness of our approaches with clinical data. And, whenever I present, somebody may say, oh, well, you're representing cellular properties, but maybe you're not representing the behavior of that protein, for instance. Our goal is to not be necessarily absolutely correct. Our goal is to be useful. So models don't have to be fully, entirely representing the mechanistic relationships, but they have to be clinically useful. And so our work is towards democratizing heart patient care, and we really want to incorporate whatever we do in the clinical workflow, and we have been quite successful in doing that. So this will also ensure standardization across the various clinical centers that do the procedure. So our clinical translation work consists of two main branches. One is diagnostics. Typically, we work on predicting risk of sudden cardiac death, which is the biggest killer of everything. So this is a massive problem of humongous clinical significance. So we have made big inroads in that direction. We also work on treatment, predicting the best treatment for the patient. And this is guidance for ablation for atrial and ventricular arrhythmias. And I'll show you some of that. So I'm going to start with the digital heart technology for predicting risk of sudden cardiac death of arrhythmia. So what does that mean? What causes sudden cardiac death? So if you have a heart attack survivor, so in heart attack, a blood vessel gets blocked in your heart and parts of the heart die. So what happens is the patient would develop scarring in the heart. Normally in the heart, you have an electrical signal that propagates smoothly through the heart and triggers contraction. But when you have scarring in the heart, the electrical impulse cannot propagate through the heart in a smooth fashion, gets caught in the scarring, and kind of moves in a chaotic fashion, which results in the ECG that you have seen having either very fast or actually even chaotic. And that leads to hemodynamic collapse. The heart cannot pump, and sudden cardiac death ensues. So patients that have survived heart attack, they are at increased risk of sudden cardiac death. As I said, the electrical wave, shown here in white arrows, gets caught here and enters on itself. This is called re-entry. So instead of propagating through an area, then it goes around the scar and comes back on itself. So this is particularly causes these recirculating electrical waves in the heart that are so dangerous. What is the treatment for this? Currently, the only way to get a patient out of this condition is to deliver an electrical shock. So patients who are at high risk for sudden cardiac death, they have actually implanted defibrillators. You know about that. The device is implanted in the patient's chest, and there is an electrode that senses the arrhythmia and delivers the shock. The problem, though, is that we do not have an accurate criterion to determine who actually is at risk for sudden cardiac death. So there is a clinical criterion called ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is the amount of blood that is pumped out with every heartbeat. So when ejection fraction of a patient gets below 35%, it is deemed at the risk for sudden cardiac death. Now, the problem here is that this is a plumbing problem. This is a plumbing criterion. It's a hemodynamics criterion when sudden cardiac death is an electrical problem. So in other words, as if you have an electrical problem at home and you call the plumber to fix it. So that's what this is. This is how the clinical criterion does not work. So for every patient that has a defibrillator that's implanted to prevent sudden cardiac death, another 20 will have defibrillators implanted that they do not need them. And living with a defibrillator is pretty horrible, right? They can discharge often, and it is horrendous. It's very painful, like a horse kicking you in the chest. People lose consciousness. It's a problem of lifestyle. Many people are in therapy because they have psychological problems. So this is a massively big problem, preventing of sudden cardiac death in an appropriate way. So what we endeavored to do is to use imaging and other data, created a digital twin, like a personalized virtual heart for every patient, and then look in this model of the patient whether arrhythmias occur. And if arrhythmias occur in our model, then we deem them at high risk for sudden cardiac death. So we started with our first paper in 2016 in Nature Communications, and we called the approach virtual heart arrhythmia risk prediction. So what we do in general is we use imaging modalities. So you can see here a patient that has, this is an MRI. I don't know whether you can see right here, there is a white area. This is the infarct. And so we construct the geometries of these hearts, and you can see here it's very important to really accurately represent the scar distribution. Often around the scar, there is the so-called gray zone, which has a medium intensity on the MRI scan. These are late enhancement gadolinium. Those are contrast-enhanced scans. So we represent that. We also represent this sort of a semi-viable area. This is very arrhythmogenic. We construct these heart models. You can see here a number of patients for which we have reconstructed their hearts. You can see how different is the distribution of the scar in these patients, and therefore what this tells you is that a personalized approach probably would be best. In addition to that, we incorporate the fiber orientations because the heart contracts, so the fibers form these spiraling pathways in the heart. This is very beneficial. How do you wring water out of clothes? You do that. So the same way, the heart has these spiraling fibers, so when it contracts, it does that. So it very efficiently pumps blood. And so we incorporate the fiber orientation. We do diffusion tensor MRI scans. We have atlases that we have created. And so this is the first basically scan of a human heart, a fiber distribution in the ventricle and the atria. And Nature loved our article, so it was on the cover of Nature Reviews for 12 months in different color 2 years ago. So we do that, and then what we do is, as I said, we have the geometry, we have the distribution of the scar, we have the fiber orientation, and we do discretize at the cellular resolution. So basically, we represent the cellular behavior. So we have equations in this model that represents what's happening electrically at 300 micron resolution. So we have ionic transport across the membrane, we have calcium cycling in the cell. All that is incorporated in this complex, personalized model. And then we can play with that model and determine what should be the outcome or whether they will have an arrhythmia. So let me show you here, this is our first study that I showed you in Nature Communications, where we had, this was a study of 41 patients. Now, those are demanding computational models. 41 patients, they all were deemed at high risk. At Hopkins, they all got defibrillators implanted. And then they were monitored whether the defibrillators discharged to know whether they had an arrhythmia or not. Now we are blind to the clinical outcome. We don't know anything. So we are just given the images. Go ahead and predict. So these are 32 patients that all were predicted at high risk and all had defibrillators. And what we predicted is that of these 32, well, my movie is not playing, but you can see here is in 32 of them, they were arrhythmias. And so the arrhythmia looks like a recirculating wave, as I said. So you can see here the wave of electrical activity. And in these 10 hearts, we predict, although they got defibrillators implanted and were considered at very high risk for sudden cardiac death, we demonstrated that that was not beneficial. So then everything was done. We compared our approach with, I told you, ejection fraction right here, and you can see how much better we were, like much, much better than any current clinical criterion. Then we repeated the study for patients with low risk. We were also able to correctly predict whether they have. This is really a huge problem for patients who are not deemed at high risk, because if somebody is not deemed at high risk, they go home, and 2/3 of these people will die of sudden cardiac death in the prime of their life. Right? They are not protected because they were not deemed at high risk. So catching the people that are at risk but not follow the clinical criterion is extremely important. So this is a very successful study that we had back then. And then we went ahead and we said, well, we are really very correctly representing the mechanistic component of the arrhythmia, what happens in the patient's heart. However, there are clinical factors that also add to the risk prediction that could be incorporated. So then, this is our first combination of the digital twin technology with artificial intelligence. So instead of just determining whether arrhythmia can occur based on the virtual heart from the patient, we use AI to incorporate also clinical data, and only then we stratify risk. So we do that for more complex diseases. The first, as I told you, was patients with infarction. This one, it's a much more complex disease called cardiac sarcoidosis. This is an inflammatory disease. It has a genetic component. And what happens in this disease, the heart develops areas of inflammation as well as areas where fibrosis grows. And so this is a PET scan that shows inflammation, and this is the MRI scan showing fibrosis scarring that occurs in the heart. So this is our paper, got published last year in one of the science journals, where we predict the risk of sudden cardiac death using this multimodality image and personalized heart modeling, everything combined in a multivariate machine learning classifier. So the patient consisted, it was 45 patients, they both had contrast-enhanced MRI, LG, plus PET scans, and they had both fibrosis and inflammation, and 36% of them apparently had arrhythmia. We don't know that. So we are given again only the clinical scans. So from the clinical scans, we created for the first time this MRI PET fusion model. The fusion model shows where is the distribution of inflammation, where is the distribution of fibrosis. Sometimes you have areas of overlap. together, and we create this very heterogeneous model of the patient's heart. And that is the model for each patient that we are going to use to assess the risk of sudden cardiac death. Now, before we do that, we did clinical validation of the model, since it's the first of its kind. So we took a few patients, we predicted what is the electrical activity, we predicted where is the perpetuator of the arrhythmia, and we compared with the clinical interventional study done in these patients. And we had excellent results. So we predicted, for instance, that this patient will have an arrhythmia in this direction, and that the red dots shows where the doctors found them. So in this way, we were able to demonstrate that the model works well. So we do simulations with each patient's heart where arrhythmia occurs. Then we take the output of the simulation. So this is really rich data. Again, we have 300 micron resolution. It's over minutes of arrhythmia, a discretization of, very fine time step. So all the simulation results that are based on the MRI PET scans and incorporate the cellular electrical properties at the ionic channel level. All that simulations, we output them, combine them with imaging data, clinical data in a classifier, and then we construct what we call the CHI risk predictor. The CHI stands for Computational Heart plus Artificial Intelligence Risk Predictor. And so that's what we used to predict the risk of sudden cardiac death in these patients. And you can see here, what's very important is those are the results, and we had sensitivity and specificity, which was very, quite high. This is our predictive capability in cross-validation. So let's compare it to what is done currently in the clinic. So you can see here, if you use the ejection fraction criterion, here is what the sensitivity is, extremely low. The just detection on MRI, whether there is a patient has fibrosis, has low specificity, the same for inflammation. So our classifier was actually, one of the hyperparameters was this balanced sensitivity and specificity, and also we have very good predictive capability. So the advantages of this approach, it really is based on the underlying mechanisms. It incorporates all the electrical activities. It can also combine data, as you saw, from many imaging modalities, and definitely is better than any current approaches. And I can do it in a small cohort of patients. I don't need a huge amount of data for my classifier to learn, because the laws of physics, the physiology is all incorporated in the simulation data. So that doesn't have to be learned. So now I want to show you what we did with sudden cardiac death, where we did not use the digital twin technology, but we used actually only AI, and in this case, deep learning for risk of sudden cardiac death. So this is a very new study published this spring. So we did something dramatically different. First of all, we called our approach, predicting risk of sudden cardiac death, we're going to use MRI images, again, contrast enhanced. So we termed our study Survival Study of Cardiac Arrhythmia Risk, SCAR abbreviation, a pun. So what our approach consists is of two deep neural network. So one of them learns on the clinical images, directly clinical MRIs. The other neural network learns on the clinical data, on the clinical covariates. The most important thing is that we embedded these deep learning networks in a survival analysis. So what we are able to do is to predict risk of sudden cardiac death over 10 years in this case. So we create for each patient here an individual risk prediction curve. So you can tell what is the probability of the patient dying of sudden cardiac death over 10 years. The most important and interesting component of this is a fairly big patient cohort for us. Now, we were totally lazy it's really difficult to segment these images with the SCAR. So we took a completely different approach, and our learning is on raw clinical data. straight from the imaging. It's never done before. So we learn from raw clinical imaging data. We do not segment. It's just fed from the scanned data. Also, what is interesting in our approach, the uncertainty in the prediction is learned from the data. So we can tell for each patient, okay, your probability is so-and-so at what time, and here is our uncertainty in this prediction. So this was a radically new approach to predicting risk of sudden cardiac death. Let me show you the patient population. This was very interesting. So the internal cohort, so we had an internal cohort on which we trained the data. These were patients with high risk for sudden cardiac death with ejection fraction less than 35%. There were 156 patients. Now you have to understand, MRI is not done on every patient. It's an expensive scanning. So these were collected from hospitals in Maryland and Delaware in United States. So this is our internal cohort. And what we decided to do is to test on a completely different external cohort that was not the same. So if it predicts in internal cohort and the algorithm is really good, it should be able to work on a different external cohort. So these were patients that were collected. The PI was at Harvard, from different hospitals, 60 hospitals through the United States, from patients who have MRIs, and they were with medium risk of sudden cardiac death. So what we wanted to demonstrate is really generalizability of our approach. So we did it, we predicted it, and this is the overall performance in our predictor. This is the receiver operating characteristic curve. And what you see here is on the internal validation and external data now. This is an average of 10 years. So look how well it predicts over 10 years period. This is the precision recall curve as well, very high numbers here. So this was really a massive achievement for us. You can see here how, for instance, when I talked about each prediction carries the uncertainty, here is one patient. This is the personalized probability curve, and you see here the probability is the highest. We predicted the patient will have sudden cardiac death at that time, and they indeed had. We were blind to the data. And this is another patient for whom we were not that certain. You can see the uncertainty is embedded here. And here was when we predicted, and that's when the event occurred. And this is comparing to like Cox prediction and so forth. I don't want to bore you with that. It's another performance breakdown here of our approach. We also broke it down to see if you predict only on the images or only on the clinical covariates. No previous deep learning has been done on clinical covariates. So the red bars are the integrated Breyer score, and the lower they are, the better. And you can see that for all approaches, ours is the best. And even if you do only the covariates, we are doing much better than the other approaches. The blue are the Breyer score, C index, F score. They have to be, the higher they are, the better. And you can see they are the best. What we did also is we tried to lift the hood under these deep neural networks and see what's happening. So we did the gradient activation maps to see what were the features that are most predictive. And it was particularly interesting to look at the images, because so what is the neural network picking up? So what we demonstrate, it is not a mere scar colocalizer. It picks areas, different areas. And for instance, here is a patient for which it had scar, but it did not pick up anything, and the patient was really indeed at low risk for sudden cardiac death. We were able to also show which of the clinical covariates are most important for the predictor, and so forth. So why do we think this is so awesome? Because, again, it offers accurate prediction of probability of sudden cardiac death up to 10 years. It learns from raw images for the first time. It's so tedious to segment cardiac images. really cardiac MRI with the scar, and it offers entire probability of distribution of time to sudden cardiac death that is personalized to the patient. It is we demonstrated generalizability, and therefore we believe it can become a personalized, groundbreaking strategy for non-invasive prediction. Now, here is the paper, appeared this April in Nature Cardiovascular Medicine. This is the first author of the paper, who is actually Romanian. It's my grad student. I don't have anything to do with Romania, I'm not, but my grad student was Romanian. This is we were also on the cover of the journal. This is our slice of the heart with the deep neural network that Dan generated. What's interesting here is that when we published the paper, couple months after that, Dan became the vice president for data science and engineering at Goldman Sachs, straight from the paper to that position. So you can see the appreciation of what was done. So, and we had such a publicity about this paper. So Elena told me that she saw it, and that's why I'm here in the business press. And the pinnacle of my career is Saturday Night Live talking about our paper. So this is an American comedy show, and so I've gotten there. It was an amazing study, and we are hoping now, working with Johns Hopkins, to potentially implement throughout the hospitals. Okay. Following that, actually, I was invited to write a piece for The Lancet on, with Dr. Eric Topol, in case you know him. On what is our view of, how can we use deep learning for prediction of sudden cardiac death. So if you're interested into the essay in The Lancet, you can take a look. The second part of my talk is on treatment for, exactly 10:30. What we do for treatment. So this was predicting risk of sudden cardiac death. So in treatment, we work for predicting of atrial and ventricular arrhythmia treatment. When I say treatment, what do I mean? So we create this digital heart technology for arrhythmia ablation. What is an ablation? So I told you that when we have scarring, arrhythmia occurs in the distribution of scarring. So what do you do for a patient that has that? One is you can give them antiarrhythmic drugs that don't work very well. And the second is, and much more useful technology, is to ablate. Ablation is delivering burning at these areas where the electrical wave gets caught up and recirculates. So if you deliver it there and you stop the electrical wave from going around, then it can propagate pretty smoothly. The question is, the big question is, where exactly to give it? You can have a pretty big scar and distribution. Where would you give these burns? So let me start with atrial arrhythmias. Now, the atria, the upper chamber in our heart, and as the ventricles, they can actually develop a lot of scars. So these are a number of atria, the upper chambers of patients, and you can see in green is the distribution of fibrosis. Fibrosis is like scar, but more distributed. When you have an infarct, it's pretty compact. When we age, we have fibrosis that grows particularly in the atria. And here you can see that distribution, and it's really personalized distribution. We don't really can predict what it is. So the question is, where, if you have a recirculating electrical wave in one of these atria, where do you burn? So, and typically this is done in the clinic. What happens is they would burn a patient, they would come back because they didn't catch it right. So there is a constant need of rehospitalization. Patients are repeatedly ablated, sometimes 5 times. And there is every ablation worsens the damage to the heart. You're adding lesions to the original native fibrosis. And so here is a movie that shows how the electrical wave is recirculating, and it's really difficult to catch where to ablate. So here I have a pink dot, if you can see it. So this turns out to be the main rotor. So if you catch that one and you burn it, then the rest will stop. But how to find that one? That is the big question. So we had another paper published in Nature Biomedical Engineering on ablation guidance using the digital heart technologies. And it was entitled Computationally Guided Personalized Targeted Ablation for Persistent Atrial Fibrillation. Patients who have persistent atrial arrhythmia, they are the worst. They have the most fibrosis, the worst distribution. So this was a prospective study. What does that mean is we predict they actually burned the patient in the clinic, right? There was no testing before. We did it straight in the clinic. So in a way, it's a testament to my relationship with the clinical colleagues that they actually trusted us to treat their patients based on computational modeling. We called the approach OPTIMA, Optimal Target Identification via Modeling of Arrhythmogenesis. So this was like a most exhilarating study in terms of what you're doing. It's the immediacy of it when the patient is treated. So here is the approach. And here is what's so cool about that. So this is the atria. This is the pre-ablation MRI with contrast enhanced. We segment the MRI. Really difficult problem. The atria are very, very thin. So this is really difficult to do. And I'll tell you what we did about that. So it's the distribution of fibrosis in this patient. And then we calculated where would be those most important rotors so we can burn them. Now, the important thing is we predict where to ablate. That's not what we give to the clinicians. We do something different. We do a mock-up of the clinical procedure in the model. Why is this important? Because in the clinic, when you do an ablation and let the patient go home, they will develop very often again an arrhythmia. So what we did is, once we identified the targets, we perform virtual ablations and then do the same simulation again to see where the new ones arise. And then repeat this circle until we are 100% sure no arrhythmias can arise. So in a way, as in the beginning I said, that's one of the big advantages of the digital heart technology, because it allows you to anticipate the patient's response to treatment. So in a way, we're anticipating what happens after the ablation, so we take care of that, so the patient does not come for a repeat ablation. So this is what happens is the patient is in the is here on the procedure room, and we see on the screen, on their screen, what the clinicians see is our targets predicted. And so it's really quick. They basically navigate the ablation catheter to our prediction. And that's basically the study. So I want to show you, here is one patient. This patient had previous ablation. PVI stands for pulmonary vein isolation. It's basically they encircle their pulmonary veins, and it failed. So we created the model, and you can see where the recirculating wave gets caught. There was another one in a different location up here. And so we predicted that. This is displayed on the screen, and they navigated the catheter there. Another patient, this was the only patient with the first-time procedure. And so what we found, that there was one rotor, and they went there, and you can see here the location of it. They go with the catheter and burn it. And so here is the outcome of these 10 patients. So normally, about 40% of the patients, this is a successful first procedure. In 60%, they come back for ablation in the first year, mostly, some in the first 3 months, after the first 3 months. And so this is our follow-up time, and you can see only one came back, much better success. Only one came back for reablation, and the reason is that they didn't catch all the targets because the procedure ran long. He had a lot of targets. Anyways, it was a very successful approach. And so here are the important conceptual advantages. It's very targeted. It's based on the individualized fibrosis distribution. And the final ablation targets include this response of the patient to the initial ablation. That's very, very important. No matter how good catheters in atrial fibrillation, this is one of the big, how much better the catheter will be, how much better we can map it with an electrode. It will never tell you what is the response of the patient. And we believe this can decrease and eliminate redo procedures. So once this study got published, I actually approached the FDA and they were very excited about it. So they approved a randomized clinical trial of 160 patients to demonstrate the utility of the Optima approach. The clinical trial is at Hopkins. It's a single center because we're doing the computational analysis. So the patients are randomized to pulmonary vein isolation, which is the standard of care, or doing our specialized targeting. And so, since imaging is so important, I basically hired like the best guy in atrial imaging. So he's doing my scans. And no, it says 22 patients. We've done 25 ablated thus far. COVID slowed us down a little bit, but I want to say it is a huge deal for us and for Hopkins because it is the first time that FDA has approved a computationally driven technology for treating patients. So some of our Optima patients, you can see different distributions of fibrosis. Again, processing the images to, to outline the personalized fibrosis, extremely onerous, takes like 6 hours or more. So we are like, okay, we are not going to do this anymore. So we developed a deep neural network to basically segment the atria. And it can be applied to MRIs or CT. And what's important also, it does both atria. So far, nobody else has segmented the right atrium. People focus on the left atrium because the pulmonary veins are there. So we are using these neural networks to segment these images. What right now is the MICI meeting. There is an atrial segmentation challenge, and we are performing the best. So my student is going to Singapore to present this. We did a really sophisticated cascade of 4 neural networks to segment that. So it will be presented soon and the paper will be published. Really excited about that. So some of the patient statistics for the Optima clinical trial. What is interesting, we are collecting all the data. We have like a dashboard where all the simulations are there because the targets, the way you predict it, you repeat that. All that data is in a single repository. So also we are going to do deep learning on the computational results once all this is done to understand why in some patients one thing happened, in another a different thing. So we also what we also want to do is, because here we predict where to ablate, and we are doing that for patients with persistent atrial fibrillation, these that have a lot of fibrosis, but there are patients that have paroxysmal, so it comes and it goes, the arrhythmia. For these patients, it also could be beneficial to receive this treatment. So we wanted to see, is there any way to predict who of these patients will have that, can be appropriate for our approach. So what we did is we wanted to apply machine learning pre-procedure to determine whether the patient is good for our approach. If they are good, then they can undergo our procedure. So we are attacking this front approach, machine learning approach, to predict which of the patients are appropriate for our procedure. And it consists, similarly to one of the ventricular studies, of creating a model and then exporting to the results of the model, combine it with imaging and clinical data, and then we have basically a risk predictor. Risk of recurrence of atrial fibrillation. If the patient has risk of recurrence, then they would not undergo the standard clinical procedure, they will undergo ours. So we did a study on these patients, and of course we were blind to the clinical outcome, and we were able to demonstrate that you can create a model from the images, And then we did a feature selection from the imaging and combined it with the results from the computational analysis, and we are able to discriminate which patients will have recurrence of atrial fibrillation with a pretty good accuracy. So now the approach would be, once we are finished with the clinical trial and we demonstrate the utility of the approach, we will tack in the front this machine learning approach to determine which patients are good for our approach. We also have another area of research that was on the atrial arrhythmias. So we also had a different approach for ventricular arrhythmias. It's another paper published in Nature Biomedical Engineering. This was a virtual heart technology for guiding ablation of infarct-related ventricular tachycardia. So in a way, it is similar to the atrial. The problem with that, with the ventricular, is that ventricular arrhythmias are little. So it's really hard to trust for the, for the clinicians at the FDA to trust computational modeling, because if we do something wrong, the patient will die. So a fewer patients are receiving that procedure, but it is generally the outcome could be fatal if it doesn't work. So we did a study to demonstrate the utility of the digital twin technology, and it's very similar to the atrial. And you can see we create the model, we predict where to ablate, and then we repeat that until we eliminate every possibility for the arrhythmia. And then we incorporated that in the clinical workflow. So the patient comes in the morning, it's executed, and we are able to predict. So I want to show you only one patient. So here is the left ventricle of a patient that had scarring and arrhythmias. And so we did the simulations. So the whole study, this study in Nature Biomedical Engineering, had 21 retrospective patients, and we did 5 prospective in 2 clinical centers. It was not Hopkins, and 2 different ones. But so let me show you one retrospective patient. So we predicted that in this patient, it has to be ablated here, here, and here. So this shows transparently the thickness of the wall. So we predicted that, and here is what happened. This is the first ablation procedure. It was exactly done. This is a projection. They're coming from the inside of the wall. So they burned exactly. This is the projection of where the catheter was. So they burned exactly in the area where we predicted, but notice how much bigger it is. So they're doing a lot more damage to the heart. So the patient went home. In 7 months, the patient came back for redo ablation. Look where they ablated, exactly where we predicted. So what that tells you is, if the patient had come in the hospital and would have been ablated by our prediction at these 3 locations, instead of just 1, they would not have come back and be rehospitalized and undergo this again. So you can see how, well-being of the patient, healthcare savings, all that is part of this. So that's what we are doing. The FDA approved now an initial study of Hopkins also for the ventricular approach. So we're going to be doing that. Now, again, here you can see creating these models from the images is, with the scar distribution is not an easy job. So we also did a deep neural networks to learn how to segment these contrast-enhanced ventricular images. The paper got published last year. What we did here is really interesting, because when we developed the approach, the neural networks are constructed in such a way that at the end it ensures that the anatomy is correct, because otherwise, since these are short axis slices, sometimes the learning approaches you can see displacement of the prediction. So we ensure that we have an anatomical accuracy of the ventricle that's reconstructed. And also, what this allows to do is to extract immediately the volume of the left ventricle, like this, which is a very important parameter. It allows you to extract immediately what is the volume, total mass of the scar, and so forth. So, the approach was actually really, very clinically important. Here is the neural networks that, it's a cascade of 3 neural networks. And I wanted to show you some results. So for instance, this is the growth truth segmentation, the predicted segmentation that actually was really good. So what we are doing here is we have separate AI, separate digital heart technology, but we are combining them either in the risk predictors or in the model building as well to be able to construct appropriately and incorporate all that in the clinical workflow. So the advantages of all these approaches for predicting ablation is that it's targeted, so that the lesions are smaller. The final ablation set, it includes the patient's response to initial ablation, the emergent arrhythmia post-ablation, so that decreases rehospitalization and damage to the heart and just well-being to the patient. And the approach is suitable for multiple imaging modalities and patient pathologies. As I said, we are starting an FDA-approved clinical study of Hopkins for the ventricular arrhythmias, and I currently have a prospective study also in the UK at St. Bart's Hospital in London. We've done 17 patients. We have predicted where to ablate there, and they have done it prospectively. So I am at the 50th minute of my talk, so the take-home messages are that combining personalized mechanistic computational modeling and artificial intelligence approaches really broadens the patient data input and offers explainability to the algorithms. I believe that these two approaches are really poised to become major tools in precision medicine and cardiology. And so I want to acknowledge all the team in my lab and in the center that I direct, all the clinical collaborators. You can see how important the clinical collaborators are here. They're completely on board with us. Like, it is really amazing to be able to be part of a clinical procedure, to bring a student to the clinical procedure who has done the simulation, and they're there, and the clinician goes, should I proceed? And then we say yes. And so it's this personal responsibility, this exhilarating capability of the modeling that really has been such an important driver for us. If you're interested in what we do, this is my lab's webpage. And also this is the center that I direct, that I created, that has engineers, applied math, radiology, and also the interventional clinical collaborators. So if you want to check it out.